Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of What's Going On, and I'm your host, Tom D'Ambra. As always, we thank you very, very much for spending time with us. We wanted to do a little bit of a continuation of last week's show. We were getting into the facts of Charlie Sheen's 20-point paper that he sent to the president, and his hopes was that he would get 20 minutes with the president to sit down and discuss his concerns regarding the events of 9/11. We did go over his 20-point plan. His 20 points that he wanted to make, strong points. There were many points there that could have been added to it, but for sake of time, obviously, obviously the President of the United States has a lot of people absorbing his time. Charlie understood that, and he wanted to highlight some of the points that raised concern to him with regarding to events that took place and the lies and deception that have come forward since then. I do want to open up with a quote that we used from Mein Kampf. For those of you who don't know, very interesting reading. Mein Kampf was a book written by Adolf Hitler, which is really, really interesting. But this quote is what I wanted to start off with, folks. I think it really sums it all up here with the events of 9/11. In the size of the lie, there is always contained a certain factor of credibility. Since the great masses of the people will more easily fall victim to a great lie than to a small one. And what he's saying here, folks, is that, a big event, to get that, the reaction that they look for people, the reason why they have these events anyway, as we've discussed in this show multiple times, is called the Hegelian dialect. Problem, reaction, solution. I don't want to be redundant, but it's very, very important that you understand this, because this is their modus operandi. This is their avenue. This is how they create these events. And what it is this, is that they want to create a crisis to get a reaction from the general people, so they'll welcome their authority, okay, and the authority being the solution. Problem, reaction, solution. 9/11 comes, 343 firefighters die, 2,844 civilians die, the towers come down, all the events that took place, the horrific events that took place. And again, the people, now they were willing to go to war. Now they were willing for this military budget to be quadrupled. Now they were ready for the expansion of war into Afghanistan and into Iraq, even though, as we have demonstrated with the FBI's own website, Osama bin Laden had nothing to do with 9/11. But again, it's the deception, it's the facade that they did. And folks, you got to understand this. Did the government or the television screen ever present any evidence to you that Osama bin Laden was involved with this? A man who needs dialysis about every 2 weeks, living in a cave in Bora Bora, Afghanistan. There's not dialysis machines in Bora Bora, Afghanistan, in the middle of caves. Okay. Now we do know that Osama bin Laden, in July, from July 14th to July 28th, was at the Dubai American University Hospital and met with the CIA station chief on 3 occasions, according to hospital records, okay, in July of 2001. So if, in fact, they were looking for Osama bin Laden, they had a prime opportunity to capture him or arrest him at that point. The other thing we want to get into is the fact that multiple countries have offered to give Osama bin Laden to the United States authorities, but they requested evidence presenting to them, to these foreign countries, before they gave up Osama bin Laden with regard to the events of 9/11, that he was linked to them, connected to them, had helped facilitate them in any way. And no evidence was ever presented to any of these countries, and that's the reason why he was never given up. We've also got into the point that Osama bin Laden is known as Tim Osama in the CIA. We have demonstrated to you that if you go to Google and Google Osama bin Laden CIA asset Tim Osama, you'll actually, on the computer screen, will come up a photo of his CIA ID. Folks, within the CIA, the name of Al-Qaeda is Al-Qaeda, as a joke. Okay, and it's not a joke, it's a cruel joke, because we founded and fund Al-Qaeda. Just like the Mossad in Israel funds and founded Hamas. Okay, so you've got to understand that this is all part of the funded opposition, and I don't want to digress too much into that. But what Hitler is speaking of here is you have to have a dramatic event so you can get the reaction from the people that you want, that you desire. okay? And key bono, again, who is benefiting from these events, all right? The bankers benefit very well because to go to war, you have to facilitate the tools of war. Now, as we've demonstrated in this show on multiple occasions, we literally do not have money. Remember the coinage jacks that we went over? We took out our Black's Law Dictionary and we gave verbatim a definition of what money is and what money is not. And if you saw that show, it was quite obvious to anyone listening that we do not have money. We have Federal Reserve notes. We've gotten to the fact that the Federal Reserve is a private foreign bank, has nothing to do with the federal government, how Paul Volcker put that name in deceitfully, and so forth. So again, who is benefiting from the events of war? Is it the people like you and I who have left their families and are going out to facilitate war with our blood? No, it is the bankers who are facilitating war with their credit and creating these crises, because war does two things. The drums of war consolidate the people. I believe in one of the shows we got into how England and France back in the 15th century, even though the king and queen of both countries were related through the Saxons, that we got into the fact that the King of England actually sent a letter to the Queen of France and said, hey, you know, I've got a lot of civil domestic unrest in my country. You two do. Let's facilitate a war, gather the people around the flag, create the outside threat to take, and they'll rally around the flag, and they will forget, for lack of a better word, or at least allow the domestic disturbance that will go on will be shifted. All that energy of anger and everything else will be shifted to the outside threat. And that's what they did. So again, these events are constantly fabricated. In this show, we're going to get into some of the false flag operations that have taken place, some within our time also. But I also want to go back to Hermann Göring. I know we did this in the last show, but I just think this quote is so particular to the events of today. Now, this was at the Nuremberg trials, okay, and this is a quote from the record of the Nuremberg trials by Hermann Göring. Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor in Germany. That is understood. But after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it is a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them that they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country. Again, we're going to get into a couple of false flag operations that the Nazis brought forward on their people. Because you got to understand, folks, I know we compare Germany a lot to the United States today, and I have a saying that we are 1933 Germany right now, and for multiple reasons I say that. But the German people were very educated people. They were very, very proud of their country. They were proud of their history, and it was if you want to study how the powers to be can create events to take the people down the avenue or the road that they desire, study the German people from the 1920s to about 1945, 47. You'll be amazed, okay? So I don't want to get too much back into 9/11, but one of the things that someone had mentioned to me, and I want to go over it again, was the fact that we were all told that the cockpit voice recorders, you know them as the black boxes, were never found. And I want to demonstrate to you, again, to this person, how they were found and who found them. Okay, this is honorary firefighter Mike Baloney and now retired New York firefighter Nicholas DeMasi claimed publicly to have found 3 of the 4 black boxes at the WTC rubble before 2002. They said they turned the boxes over to FBI agents who told them to stay quiet. Then I want to get into this other thing about, according to the FBI, the 9/11 Commission report, even though the WTC rubble was combed for fingernails and bone fragments, not a single one of the 4 indestructible black boxes were found. However, National Transportation Secretary Board spokesman Ted Lopotzkowitz said that he could never recall a domestic case before 9/11 in which the recorders were not recovered. According to the 9/11 Commission, them recorders were never found. All 8 of them have been missing. Never happened. But of course, I can understand why 4 of them have not been found, and I will tell you the reason why. Because according, and you saw that in some of the documentaries that we presented, I believe it was Loose Change 2, that according to one of the gentlemen who is the maintenance, keeps the record of maintenance for United Airlines for all the planes, you know, certain amount of flight hours, certain things have to be you know, either maintenance or replaced and so forth. And that's very, very particular. They have to keep up on that. Well, according to this one gentleman, I forget his name right now, and I apologize for that, but he was in the documentaries we presented. According to him, the planes that supposedly hit the Pentagon and supposedly was shot down or crashed in Pennsylvania are still flying today, and he proved that with maintenance records from the number of the aircraft. And since that documentary, another person in New York went on the internet with it. It was taken off the internet eventually, but actually with the plane, the aircraft identification number demonstrated that on the internet that this one particular plane was still flying. So according to UAL maintenance records, the planes that supposedly crashed in Pennsylvania and the Pentagon are both actively flying today. I'm not making this up. This is according to United Airlines, okay? There was a last show we didn't get into this, and I want to be real quick about it. You know, folks, the United States military are not stupid people. Most people who are in the military are there because they're red, white, and blue and true, okay? And we got into how Dick Cheney had taken over command of NORAD in July and then relinquished it again back in October, how it was the first time in the history of NORAD this has ever taken place. Then we also got into the statements from the gentleman from the Air Force who was now out of the Air Force, and how Dick Cheney gave the orders to stand to let them planes crash into the Pentagon and so forth. But what happened, what our own Pentagon did to confuse, if you would, our air defenses was they had 3 operations going on at that time. Actually, there was 2 that directly affected the defense mechanisms, air defense mechanisms of the Eastern Seaboard at that time. One of them was Operation Northern Vigilance, and this thing was to ensure that many jet fighters would have normally been patrolling the East Coast were flying over Alaska and northern Canada in a drill that simulated a Russian air attack, complete with false radar blips. The false radar blips are very, very important, because you've got to understand at the time that these people who were in charge of the civilian air transport and making sure, you know, all the people in the ATC, the air traffic controls and so forth, who you know, mechanize all this stuff and coordinate all these efforts, they were confused. They didn't know which planes were real. They didn't know which planes were part of the false radar blips, and they didn't know if the actual events of 9/11 were part of this Operation Northern Vigilance. I believe it is in Loose Change 1, if not in plain sight, where they actually have the recording from the air traffic controllers to NORAD, and and they're asking, is this a drill or real time? In other words, is this part of the drills that are going on, or is this actually taking place? So there was a lot of confusion. Our military was deceptively confused, and because of the fact of these 2 operations. The other one's name was Operation Vigilant Guardian. It simulated hijacked planes in the northeast sector, which would be New York and New England. While the real hijackers were in the same airspace, this drill had NORAD and the Air Force reacting to false blimps on FAA radar screens. Some of these blips corresponded to real military aircraft in the air posing as hijacked aircraft. That's why when NORAD's airborne control commander, Lieutenant Colonel Dawn Deskins, heard Boston claim that it had a hijacked airliner, her first words were, "It must be part of the exercise." Again, these plans were put in prior to September 11th to confuse our Eastern Seaboard defense mechanisms. We also got into in the last show how Andrews Air Force Base, actually most of their aircraft that were meant to protect Washington, D.C. were down in North Carolina as part of Operation Vigilant Guardian. So, you got to understand the fact that, don't think that our military didn't have the capabilities of stopping this operation. All right, they were deceived and lied to from the inside. Okay. Now I want to give you a quote from Air Force Colonel Robert M. Bowman. You may know that name. He's the former director of what we know as the Star Wars Space Defense Program. This was during the Reagan administration. He has since retired, but they were asking him some quotes regarding 9/11 once he retired. He wouldn't speak prior. But listen to this quote. This is very, very interesting. If our government had merely done nothing and allowed normal procedures to happen on the morning of 9/11, the Twin Towers would still be standing and thousands of dead Americans would still be alive. This is treason. And what he's speaking of, again, is the fact of how the plans that were set up, the Dick Cheney taking control. In other words, if the United States government had just allowed all the things that were in place for the defense of our country and facilitated them, just the normal procedures, this is what never happened. And that's the reason why they had to take all of the authority to strike and or defend whatever the threat was from NORAD. Because NORAD, as soon as the claim went out that these planes were hijacked, that threat would have been addressed and met aggressively and conquered. Okay, so they had to take that ability away from the military to defend ourselves so they could carry out this plan. And that's the reason why Dick Cheney did what he did. All right, so you got to understand all this. Again, I don't want to be redundant. I know we got into the last 5 or 6 shows on 9/11, but I just wanted to go over that with you. I thought that was very, 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 very important. One last person I'd like to get into here. As a matter of fact, when you start researching this, it talks multiple times about a 44-year-old former CIA asset, as Osama bin Laden. But in all this research, it comes up multiple times about how, Osama bin Laden was set up in the 70s in Afghanistan through the CIA. Some of you folks in my age group may remember them as the Mujahideen. Okay, so again, we facilitate these people. It's called the funded opposition. That's what they do. But one person I want to speak of is William Rodriguez. William Rodriguez was, for lack of a better word, a key holder of WTC 1 and 2. He was in charge of the custodial services in the buildings. He knew all the aspects of the buildings. He knew what the fire threats were. He knew the daily routines of the people, of the employees. He knew the daily routines of security. The man was very much hands-on with regards to the daily operations of the Twin Towers. You may remember that he actually was on national television with George Bush. George Bush called him a hero and so forth because, he had gone back multiple times back and forth into the buildings to save hundreds of people's lives. The man was courageous. The man was a true hero in the definition of the word. As a matter of fact, here he's talking about 9/11, and he says, he goes, this is a statement from him, William Rodriguez. And if you can actually Google William Rodriguez WTC, and there's quite a site that comes up because, like I said, this man is very courageous. He knows 9/11 was an inside job. He started out by asking questions, and then after he asked questions, they took him away from the limelight of the mainstream media. But here's a quote from him. There's reality and then there's an illusion. When illusions become reality, that's a problem. 9/11 is one giant illusion. Besides, what can they do to me? I'm a national hero. Bush told me so himself. He's talking. This is William Rodriguez talking about when he met the president, and they had, again, to bring up the hype. Remember George Bush speaking with the battalion chief at ground zero of 9/11. Okay, again, to bring up the hype. These firemen were sacrificed for the cause of the reaction. Again, problem, reaction, solution, and that's exactly what they would caused from. Folks, and when you get into the Twin Towers themselves, they were owned by a gentleman, Larry Silverstein. You saw that on some of the documentaries we presented. But some of the things they didn't get into was the fact that the Twin Towers were literally about 40% vacant. Okay, and the other thing that is interesting about the Twin Towers is that not only was it losing money, and not only did Larry Silverstein take the lease rights to the building, because in the grounds, I should say, because when you look at who actually owns them, it was a Rockefeller entity, and we've got into the Rockefellers numerous times on this program. But the other thing is that he was facing a enormous asbestos cleanup. Because when they fire coated back in the day when this was made, they used asbestos. Of course, we all know that asbestos is a very cancerous material, and so he not only was he losing money with regards to being 40% void with regards to tenants, but he also was looking at the problem of, wow, I have this millions and millions of dollars of cleanup here that I'm going to have to do to facilitate the asbestos cleanup. And so, there were a lot of problems with regards to the WTCs themselves. They were not a flourishing moneymaker. And you have to ask yourself, why would Larry Silverstein, just months prior to 9/11, take over the lease of this? A man of his position obviously is not a stupid man. But you got to ask yourself, why the separate rider for terrorist attacks with regard to payment on insurance plans? Did he know something that we didn't? So I want to try to stop with the events of 9/11 right now, because, folks, I must tell you, the documentaries that we presented to you are rather dated right now, and so much more has come out since then. But there's two questions that I always hear with regards to the events of 9/11. One of them is, okay, if they did this, what happened to the people that were on the two planes that supposedly crashed? Well, what happened, folks, according to a gentleman by the name of Colonel Don de Grand Prix, and I ask you, this fella has recently passed away, but when you read his books, he had a series of 5 books, he states that basically the planes were decompressurized through AWACS. We described what AWACS was before, Early Airborne and Command Center, and then that the planes were taken out over the Atlantic Ocean and dumped into the ocean. Whether that is true or not, I do not know. We do not have all the answers from 9/11, but we do know is that what was presented to us as facts has been concretely shown to be lies. So I don't know if that is true. I see no reason why to not believe Colonel Don de Grand Prix, but I am not stating that's what's taken place. It's the only clue that I've ever came across in all my research of the events of 9/11 as to what actually happened to the planes. The other thing I'd like to get into is people say to me, well, if they did this, this must have cost them millions. Where would they get the money without the accountability? How could they get the money through all these different budget processes, to facilitate such a thing? Because don't forget, this operation started a year ago. You've got the supposed hijackers taking flight lessons at U.S. schools right around the CIA headquarters in Langley. You've got to facilitate them. See, these hijackers, in my belief, thought that they were part of an exercise, and didn't understand that this what they were actually part of. We do know that the pilots the supposed pilots who flew these planes didn't have the education, training, nor the facilities to fly these aircraft. But again, the money question always comes up. Where would they get this kind of money to be able to facilitate such an operation? So let's get into that a little bit, okay? Now, if you remember, the 9/11 Commission came forward. Not only did they not speak of Building 7, but they also said, if you read the report, that there was no significance in looking into who funded 9/11, which is just an incredible statement in itself. Okay, but I do believe if you go to, I believe it was Loose Change 2, don't hold that to me, but one of the 4 documentaries we demonstrated had a gentleman from the Parliament and the House of Commons in England who also agreed with me that this was just incredible that the 9/11 Commission would make such a statement. It didn't matter who funded 9/11. Okay, obviously they didn't want to get into the funding of 9/11 because it was home-based funding. So, some things that you may have remembered hearing, and some things that you may have not. But let's look into the funding. Now, this, and I'm hoping we can get this on the screen for you. But basically, what this is an article from September 10th, 2001. Okay, and I want to read it to you. And this is what it says. The headline is "Missing Trillions." And yes, you heard me right. That's with a T. Trillions. Rumsfeld buries admissions of missing $2+ trillion in 9/10/01 press conference. Isn't that just so interesting? On September 10th, 2001, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld held a press conference to disclose that over $2 trillion, trillion, in Pentagon funds could not be accounted for. Rumsfeld stated, "According to estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions. Or according to a report by the Inspector General, the Pentagon cannot account for 25% of what it spends." Now, I want you to think of that. How do you lose or mismanage and not account for 2.3 trillion with a T dollars? Now, I know we don't have dollars. We've gotten into that before. But just for the sake of this, 2.3 Federal Reserve notes. Okay? I want you to think of that. And when did they announce it? They announced it on September 10th, 2001. And why do you think? Because what happened on 9/11, 2001? The events of 9/11 took place. This was thrown into the burner. Everyone forgot about it because we have this major event in front of us. But think of that. Now, then you have the Inspector General coming out and saying the Pentagon cannot account for 25% of what it spends. That should enrage you. Because what happens with the IRS or any of these other agencies, alphabet agencies that we have out, if you don't have every T crossed and every I dotted? What happens to you? Okay? What would happen if you said to the IRS, "Hey, I can't account for blah, blah, blah"? You better start accounting for it, huh? There's no accountability, folks. This is one of the things that outrages me about this whole system. The accountability is held around our necks and not theirs. How do you lose $2.3 trillion and you just happen to announce it on September 10th, 2001? Now, in this article, such a disclosure normally may have sparked a huge scandal. However, the commencement of the attack on New York City and Washington in the following morning would assure that the story remained buried. To the trillions already missing from the coffers, an obedient Congress terrorized by the anthrax attacks would add trillions more in appropriations to fight the war on terror. The comptroller of the Pentagon at the time of the attack was Dov Zakheim, who was appointed in May of 2001. Before becoming the Pentagon's money manager, he was an executive at the Systems Planning Corporation, which is a defense contractor specializing in electronic warfare technologies, including remote-controlled aircraft systems. Very, very important that you understand that. Zakheim is a member of the Project for the New American Century and participated in the creation of his 2000 position on the paper called Rebuilding America's Defenses, which called for a new Pearl Harbor. We are going to get into the Project for the New American Century on this show. Let's go forward. Estimates of the sums of the money missing vary widely. A 2003 report puts the amount missing at more than $2 trillion. And again, according to the Pentagon, they openly admit to you they couldn't account for $2.3 trillion. And according to an independent investigation, the Inspector General of the United States says the Pentagon cannot account for 25% of what it spends. Folks, I have to tell you, in doing research on missing funds from the Pentagon, even a person like myself who doesn't get too surprised anymore over the revelations that are made, Okay, I was shocked, and you got to go a long way to shock me now. I've been studying these people for a long time. I was overwhelmed at the amount of money that was unaccounted for, according to independent sources within the Pentagon. Okay, and I got pages of it here, and for sake of time, obviously we can't go through it all. But let me just be real brief. This is according to the Pentagon itself. All right, this is in 2006. The Pentagon cannot account for nearly $15 billion in payments for goods and services in Iraq, according to an internal audit of the Defense Department, which members of Congress blasted Friday as a shocking accountability failure. Of the $8.2 billion in U.S. taxpayer-funded defense contracts reviewed by Defense Department's Inspector General, the Pentagon could not properly account for more than $7.7 billion. Now, think of this. They were investigating what happened to $8.2 billion with a B. Small asset when you look at the defense projects and funding. And they could not properly account for more than $7.7 billion. So that means they could account for, out of $8.2 billion, they could account for $500 million, $0.5 billion. The lack of accountability of the funds intended for the purchases of weapons, vehicles, construction equipment, security services amounted to a mere 95% failure rate in basic accounting standards, according to the report. We estimate that the Army made $1.4 billion in commercial payments that lacked the minimum documentation for valid payment, such as properly prepared receiving reports, invoices, and certified vouchers, claimed Deputy Inspector General Mary Ugone, who told a congressional committee. We also estimate that the Army made an additional $6.3 billion of commercial payments that met the 27 criteria for payments but did not comply with other statutory and regulatory requirements. Folks, that's above and beyond the 7.7 they couldn't account for. Think of this. This should outrage you. The Pentagon also was found to have given away another $1.8 billion in Iraqi assets with absolutely no accountability, said Congressman Henry Waxman, chairman of the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. Investigators examined 53 payment vouchers and couldn't find even one that adequately explained where all this money went. Folks, we're in the trillions of dollars here. And don't forget, they know where the money went. It went to Black Ops money and all this. But the other end of that is we had to borrow this money as credit to the Federal Reserve banking system. So not only is it unaccounted for in our eyes, in the public's eyes, but what is accounted for is the fact that your labors are going to pay for this debt for the rest of your life, and your children's also, with no accountability. Another $5 billion spent on supporting Iraqi security forces could not be properly traced, according to November 2007 Inspector General report. Folks, this goes on and goes on and goes on, and then there's one I want to read here for you. American taxpayers are picking up the tab for Iraqi ministries, coalition governments, U.S. and foreign contractors, Iraqi security forces, and Blackwater and other U.S. security companies. In one remarkable instance, a $320 million payment in cash was handed over with little more than a signature in exchange. Now, what they're talking about here is they took $320 million, and I mean actual Federal Reserve notes. They put them on pallets. They loaded them on C-130 and C-141 aircraft. They flew them to Iraq. They took them off the planes in the pallet form and were giving all this money, $320 million of actual cash, was given in these pallets to an asset with no accountability, and no one knows where this money went. $320 million actual crash of cash taken off aircraft, laid on pallets, and driven away with no accountability. They didn't deliver it to my house. Did they deliver it to yours? They didn't. Where'd that money go? $15 billion, $7.7 billion. All right, 95% failure in basic economy standards. 1.8 billion, 15 billion. This is from 320 million. This is one sheet, folks. I've got a ton of them here. Get off the couch. Ask questions. Where'd this money go? Now, listen to this one. This is a separate one. This is the funding, the original funding of Operation Iraqi Freedom. And did you know originally they were going to call it Operation Iraqi Liberation? But they thought the acronym OIL, oil, would be a little bit too much even for the American sheep to swallow. The original funding for Operation Iraqi Freedom, guess what they can't account for? $492 billion, according to Yugon, who again was the Inspector General, Deputy Inspector General Mary Yugon. They can't account for $492 billion of the original funding for Operation Iraqi Freedom. Now, that's just one sheet. Let me just go through some quick ones here. Pentagon Bremer Dispute Inspector General's report. Nearly $9 billion of money spent on Iraqi reconstruction is unaccounted for because of insufficiencies and bad management, according to a watchdog group republished on Sunday. And folks, this is CNN, okay? You know, I know a lot of you get all your information from these particular sources, and you got, we're going to do a big program on the media in this country, but this isn't from sources that I look into. This is CNN. Okay, $9 billion, and then they get into here, how they facilitated this, facilitated that. There's another, then there's another story here, about the missing $21 billion. Then there's another CPF staff identified one minister that supposedly had 8,206 guards were on the payroll, and when they actually looked into the payroll, there was only 602 guards that could be validated. Think of that. They're telling the audit people that there's 8,206 guards at this one facility, or actually in this one department, I should say. But when the auditing entity looked into this on the payroll, they only found 602. Okay? They only found 602 out of 8,206. And how much money are we talking here? $8.8 billion in salaries and operating capital and expenditures. Capital expenditures were spent on that 8,206 guards, but when they looked into it, they only found 602. Again, I can go on all day about this, folks. $33 billion. Pentagon audit finds $15 billion short in Iraqi funds unaccounted for. Oh, and this was just last year. These other ones I'm reading you from are 2002, 2003, 2004. Okay? In a stunning accountability failure, out of $8.2 billion in the U.S. taxpayer-funded defense contracts for Iraq, $7.2 billion seems to be missing. Wow, imagine that. The other one we had was 8.2, and there was 7.7 billion missing from 2003. Now we're in 2008, 5 years later. Is there any accountability going on here? No. You're wondering where they got the funding for 9/11? This is where they got the funding. Now, we're talking about billions of dollars, but remember, on September 10th, 2001, okay, what was missing? $2.3 trillion. That's where they got the money, folks. This is where they get the money every day, and we haven't even gotten into the amount of money that the government, yes, is making on facilitating the drug industry in this country. Remember that quote we had from Ted Gunderson? Ted Gunderson, former FBI agent, #1 investigator for the FBI. Ronald Reagan went up to him, put a team together, said to Ted Gunderson, Ted, you're going to answer to me and Al Haig only. I want to know where this cocaine is coming from, and I want to know how we're going to stop it, and you're going to answer to me and Al Haig only. Directly. No bureaucratic ladder to climb. 6 to 7 months later, as we demonstrate on this show, Ted Gunderson walks into the president and says, Mr. President, okay, Ronald Reagan's very interested. I believe his motives were true and honorable. Says, okay, what did you discover? What he discovered, it was a shocking comment, and I've always remembered this. Mr. President, the United States government is the biggest drug dealer in the world. Okay? This is an FBI agent who spent 6 to 7 months with the top FBI team investigating this. Of course, then we got into the CIA, Medina, Arkansas, and all the rest of it. Okay? You know it as Iran-Contra. But you got to understand, folks, when we went into Afghanistan, the second area that we secured was an area called the Golden Crescent. For those of you who are in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, and so forth, you may remember the Golden Triangle. And what it was that they were shipping home. Them are the best two areas of the world to grow the poppy, which is what they derive the drugs from. You got to understand, and I know you're going to think this is really nuts, but the Taliban for 14 years had outlawed the growing of poppy. So what we did is when we went in there, we not only secured the area, but we facilitated the farmers to grow poppy, which had a wonderful crop the following spring. And I remember saying to a bunch of my colleagues and friends that you will see an incredible amount of heroin in this country within a year. And anybody who is in the medical field, law enforcement, and so forth, even here in rural Vermont, will tell you that the heroin problem has become epidemic. And I will tell you, it's only the best that the U.S. government is facilitating to your sons and daughters. Look up the Golden Crescent in Afghanistan, and I think you will be shocked. So, we've got into some of the events of 9/11. Sheets and sheets of missing trillions and billions of dollars with no accountability. You know, folks, there was a very courageous congresswoman by the name of Cynthia McKinney. She's a black congresswoman from Georgia. I invite you to go on the internet and Google her name, and then punch in missing Pentagon funds. She gave a tremendous tongue lashing on the congressional floor, which I just think is one of the best speeches of all the dog and pony shows that we have to put up with every day that I have ever heard come off the floor. She not only got into the missing money, she got into DynCorp and other things that I'm sure we may get into at some point. But don't ever say they don't have the money to do this. We have too much lack of accountability with regards to missing funds. And when you start researching the missing funds, folks, I was finding reports of missing tanks, missing missile systems, okay? 30,000 AK-47s missing in Iraq. You know, logistically, with what the Pentagon cannot account for, you could facilitate probably the 5th largest army in the whole world with what they're missing. No accountability. So, has any governments before in the history of time ever held false flag operations against what we supposedly would think of as their own people? I do know that most of you think that the government is a benevolent organization looking out here for our safety. I do believe that a lot of the mechanisms within inside the government are exactly that, particularly the military. I'm a firm believer that the people who are in the military are red, white, blue, and true. Some of them may have entered for education purposes and so forth, but the core belief of our military, I believe, again, is red, white, blue, and true. So has a governments or entities ever before in the history of man fabricated an event against its own people? Well, I can tell you in researching this, I was overwhelmed by how many I came up with. Some of them went back thousands of years, folks. Nero burning Rome, blaming on the Christians. You know, that's how Nero got the people to throw Christians, to throw human beings into the arenas with lions and tigers and so forth, and the people wanted it because the people were dubbed to believe that the Christians were responsible for the burning of Rome. When history shows and demonstrates to us that Nero's own agents burned Rome, to blame it on the Christians. It goes back that far. But what I did is I correlated 10 events that I think you'll find quite interesting, and we're going to run through these just so you understand that this is not a new method of madness. This has been going on for thousands of years. And I could have had a tremendous amount of them here, but for time's sake, again, I'm going to limit this down to just 10, okay? So before I get into this, I want to give a quote from Thomas Jefferson, one of my favorites. If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. And what Jefferson is saying here is that they bank on your ignorance. You know, we talked about before at one religion that for 900 years did not allow their people to read. We talked about the deliberate dumbing down of America, Charlotte Iserbyt's book, and why our standard of education has not only got so costly, but also why our grades and our expectations are lower and lower. Because they want you in a state of ignorance. They do not want a well-intended, well-educated, and healthy people. And ill, ignorant people are much easier to control and manifest than it is a people who are intelligent, who have an education in all the classics, and also who are well. Okay? So I want to do this in reverse order. I know I spoke of, it just happens to be the first one, number 10. We've got 10. But number 10 that I wrote down was Nero, the Christians, and the Great Fire of Rome. You know, in July 19th, 64 A.D., when the Great Fire burst through the rooftops and shops, you know, near mass entertainments and chariot racing venue called Circus Maximus. This is where the terms of bread and circus comes from, guys, because what they wound up doing was the people were hungry, so when they went to the arenas, they would actually give them bread, and that was the Circus Maximus. But again, Nero, you know, in his own logs and all, admitted doing this, okay? Another one was, remember, you know, the whole thing, remember the Maine, you know, and to hell with Spain is actually how the slogan went, but the history books will show you, you know, remember the Maine. In 1898, and this was the first time, folks, that the United States government really got into imperialism. Because in 1898, we had most of the North American territories, they were, you know, they were pretty much set in our ways with regards to, you know, the federal government. So in 1898, they needed a crisis, I should say, and what they wanted to do is they wanted to go to war with Spain. At that time, there was some territories that Spain was disputing and so forth. So what they did was they blew up a battleship that was in Havana, and it was called the USS Maine. Okay, and what happened was there was explosives that blew up from the inside of the ship. And what it says here in 1898, elites within the United States government falsely accused Spain of blowing up the USS Maine in order to stoke the American people into a flag-waving frenzy that resulted in the Spanish-American War. You got to understand, folks, this is how the Philippines became an enclave of the United States government. Okay, this is how American Samoa became an enclave of the United States government. Okay, this was not just about a battle that took place in Cuba. This was a war between two imperialistic governments. Okay, and of course, at that time, don't forget, the American people were still into state sovereignty, and I mean that literally. Even though the Civil War with the Reconstructionist Acts had pretty much done away with the state sovereignty, they still, because of time, were still into that mindset. And I'll use that as, if you remember, at that point, every state still had their own militias. Okay. As a matter of fact, the state of Vermont here sent a lot of people down to Cuba to fight the war, and you know, Arizona, just about everybody did. But this is what they had to do. They facilitate this crisis. You know, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. Hence the War of 1898. The Manchurian incident in 1931, Japan wanted to further into the Asian continent, so in a brilliant display of false flag strategy, Japan blew up its own railway and blamed it on China. And then, of course, that's known as the Manchurian incident. And when you research this, folks, it has gotten quite clear to the Chinese at that point who had actually facilitated this, okay? Japan attacked. China had no choice but to defend itself. But how did the Japanese people get them, you know, how the Japanese people get behind this incident was blowing up the railway, which was of strategic importance to Japan at the time. Then you have the Reichstag fire in 1933, a week before the general elections, that might place enough Nazis into office to make Hitler a de facto dictator. The Reichstag, which housed the parliament of the German Empire, was set on fire. Now, folks, when you compare the Reichstag fire and what took place after that, it's very, very compelling into the events of 9/11, okay? We actually went forward. The Reichstag fire, Hitler actually was elected chancellor, but after the Reichstag fire, he blamed it on the communists, and then he wound up. Once he blamed it on the communists, he formed the Nazi Socialist Party. The Nazi Party was already formed, but he actually created the position of Führer and then appointed himself into that position. Okay, the fake invasion of Gleiwitz in the evening of Thursday, August 31st, 1939, German covert operatives pretending to be Polish terrorists seized the Gleiwitz radio station on the German-Poland border in the region of Silesia, and thus Hitler invented an excuse to invade Poland, which he did the very next day, September 1st, 1939, and that was the official day. They didn't call it World War II at that point, but history shows that's when World War II began. Hitler, when you study this event, folks, he actually had actors involved with this. He had production studio work, limited as it was for the day, involved with this whole thing. And it just so happened that the very next day, he invaded Poland. Pearl Harbor on the Sunday morning of December 7th, I could get into this one forever, folks. The Japanese launched a supposed sneak attack on Pearl Harbor that decimated the U.S. Pacific Fleet and forced the United States to enter World War II. And again, folks, we had cracked the Purple Code of Japan months prior to this. As a matter of fact, Roosevelt moved Battleship Row from San Diego to Hawaii. He had the aircraft carriers go out in the open seas. He knew exactly where the German fleets were going to rendezvous and where they were coming from, because some of them left Hiroshima, some of them left Tokyo. He knew where they were going to rendezvous because, like I said, we cracked the Purple Code. He actually, folks, took the merchant marine lanes and pushed them south so our merchant marine ships would not see the Japanese fleets coming in. Okay, I could get into Pearl Harbor. I have studied that at length, and I'm just going to tell you right now that we were very much aware of what was taking place that day. On July 4th, 1954, an Israeli terrorist cell was activated inside Egypt. Yes, you did hear me say that, an Israeli terrorist cell. The ensuing attacks, cleverly designed to look like the works of Arabs, blasted and torched the American and British targets. Folks, when you get into this one, again, this is when they actually started to fund the opposition, and you know it as Hamas. U.S.-sponsored terrorism, Operation Northwoods. I did want to get into this. Obviously, we're running out of time. Maybe the next show we'll get into this in some length, because I have a copy of the whole thing. Folks, get on the internet and punch in Operation Northwoods. This has all been declassified. You will see that they were going to blow up a civilian airliner full of college students away on holiday. They were going to foment riots in Miami and Washington, D.C. They were going to attack the bases down in Gitmo. And this actually was designed by a gentleman, General named L.L. Minister, who went all the way to McNamara with this, and John Kennedy, said, you people are crazy. We're going to kill American citizens to foment war. But what were they trying to do? They were going to have this attack using our forces on our own people for the problem, reaction, solution. They would have got the reaction from the people that we would have had to go to war with Cuba. Okay? And when you get into this, they talk about Elgin Air Force Base, how they were going to paint MiGs. And I mean, it's just incredible. This document proves to you exactly at what depth these people will go, in the usurpation of power. And next show, we'll get into Operation Northwoods, but I ask you to get on the internet and look that up. And then we have the Phantoms in the Gulf of Tonkin, 1964. The USS Maddox was supposedly attacked by a group of Vietnamese patrol boats. Folks, you can read the book that was by the captain or the skipper of the USS Maddox. The attacks never took place. Okay, the other thing was that when Bob McNamara died just months ago, he pretty much admitted, to use his words, that the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was a mistake. Folks, it never happened. We bombed them people. We killed almost 2 million of them. We lost 58,000 of our own soldiers, Marines, airmen, and sailors, Coast Guardsmen. We ruined that nation. Okay, we have all the luggage that these poor fellas came back from Vietnam with, even to this day. committing, suicides from Vietnam-era veterans are extremely high, although not as high as the ones that they're seeing today with the Iraqi wars. So you got to understand, folks, if you're just going to get your information from the people who control the information outlets, you're going to be drawn right into this trap. But research that and you'll find it. And of course, the last one I put here, folks, was the September 11th attacks. And we've gotten into that quite heavily. How, in fact, who, what, where, and the whens of the 9/11. Okay, I know we've gone over that, so I'm not going to get into it too much. What I have in front of me is the actual scripts of Operation Northwoods, and we'll get into that next show. But one thing I want to get into with you, because I know most of you get your news from the mainstream media, is a report put out by a gentleman named Simon Hirsch. You may know him from the New Yorker and so forth, okay? So what I just want to read real quick to you is the following. This is an exclusive Seymour Hirsch, New York newspaper, mainstream media. To provoke war, Cheney considered a proposal to dress up Navy SEALs as Iranians and shoot at them. Okay, speaking at the Campus Progress Journalism Conference earlier this month, Seymour Hirsch, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist from The New Yorker, revealed that the Bush administration officials held a meeting recently in the Vice President's office to discuss ways to provoke a war with Iran. In Hirsch's most recent article, he reports that this meeting occurred in the wake of an overblown incident in the Strait of Hormuz, in which a U.S. carrier almost shot at by a few small Iranian speedboats. The meeting took place in the Vice President's office. The subject was, now listen to this, this is verbatim. The subject was how to create a casus belli between Tehran and Washington, okay, according to one of Hirsch's sources. During the journalism conference event, I asked Hirsch specifically about the meeting and if he could elaborate on what occurred. Hirsch explained that during the meeting in Cheney's office, an idea was considered to dress up Navy SEALs as Iranians, put them on fake Iranian speedboats, and shoot at them. This idea, intended to provoke a war with Iran, was ultimately rejected. There was a dozen, this is Hirsch speaking, I'm sorry, there was a dozen ideas pro-offered about how to trigger a war. Think of that, how to trigger a war. Because they can't just say, weapons of mass destruction. That turned out to be false in Iraq. They can't say that they had anything to do with 9/11. That turned out to be false in Afghanistan. There was a dozen ideas about how to trigger a war. The one that interests me the most was why we don't we in our own shipyards, build 4 or 5 boats that look like Iranian PT boats, put the Navy SEALs on them with lots of arms, and the next time one of our boats goes up the Strait of Hormuz, start to shoot at it. Might cost some lives. This is Cheney. And that was him saying that. It might cost some lives. See, you're cannon fodder. You're fodder. That's all you are to these people. What was it the quote that Henry Kissinger said? We had it on the show verbatim. Military men are dumb, stupid animals to be used for our policies. Henry Kissinger. And it was rejected because you can't have Americans killing Americans. That's the kind of thing, that's the level of stuff we're talking about. Provocation. Hirsch argued that one of the things the Bush administration learned during the encounter in the Strait of Hormuz was that if you can get the incident right, the American people will support it. Think they learned that lesson from 9/11? Look at it as high school. Are we playing high school with, 5,000 nuclear warheads in our arsenal? Yeah, we are. We're playing, who's the first guy to run off the highway with us and Iran? Now, you got to understand, folks, that this is exactly what we're talking about with Operation Northwoods. This is what we're talking about with 9/11 and many others, the 10 that we just briefly went over. They fabricate these incidents to get the reaction from you, okay? They had to have a war on drunk driving. What happened? Now we have roadblocks, okay? It's just ironic that in 1989, the wall comes down, the end of the communist threat, supposedly. And then in 1990, now we have the new Muslim threat. And in 1991, we have Gulf War I. You always have to have this threat to keep the people from looking in the mirror. and where we're going as a nation, where we're going as a people. You have got to ask these questions, and you may not like the answers, but that is where we are. Like I said, I got pages and pages and pages of missing Pentagon funds. I've only read, I don't think I read 10% of what I have here in front of me. I did not get into the missing tanks. Yes, missing tanks, missing aircraft, missing missile batteries. Hundreds of thousands of AK-47s. This is where we are, folks. And it's our responsibility to correct this for the sake of the future of our nation and for the people of the world. With that being said, we thank you very, very much for watching. We're always very appreciative that you take your busy day to spend an hour with us. And as always, remember, your government is your responsibility. Thank you.